You call that a paycheck? Linda's voice sliced through our kitchen like broken glass. I stood in the doorway, still wearing my hospital maintenance uniform, rainwater dripping from my jacket onto the linoleum floor. 17 years. 17 years I'd worked double shifts at Cleveland General, fixing broken pipes and faulty wiring so Linda could stay home with her daughter. Mom's right, Casey said, not looking up from her phone. It's embarrassing how little you make. Casey, the girl I'd raised since she was 8. The girl whose college tuition I'd paid with overtime money. The girl I'd walked down the aisle at her wedding last year. I do my best, I said quietly. Linda laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. Your best? Kenny, your best is pathetic. I noticed the stack of shopping bags by the back door. Designer labels, expensive perfume bottles on the counter. Bills scattered across the table like evidence of a crime I didn't understand. Where did all this come from? I asked. That's none of your business, Casey snapped. You don't pay for everything around here. But I did. The mortgage payments, the utilities, the insurance premiums. Every month for 17 years, my pathetic paychecks had kept this house running. I'm tired, Linda said, her voice suddenly cold. Tired of pretending this is enough. Tired of pretending you're enough. The words hit harder than any physical blow. I stood there in my soaked work clothes, watching my family dissolve in real time. Get out, Casey said. Just get out. I walked into the storm without an umbrella, without a plan, without anywhere to go. 17 years of marriage ending in a Tuesday night argument over money I didn't know we were spending. What Linda and Casey didn't know was that I'd been keeping records. Every receipt, every bank statement, every mysterious charge on our joint account. What they didn't know was that some of those charges were federal crimes. What they didn't know was that the quiet maintenance man they'd dismissed was about to become their biggest problem. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The late shift at Dayton General Hospital ended with broken door hinges and a sore back. Mark Ellison, 64, pulled off his work gloves and walked through empty corridors. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. His footsteps echoed against linoleum. Cold February air hit his face as he pushed through the glass doors. The drive home took 15 minutes through quiet streets lined with ranch houses. Briarwood Drive looked the same as always. Yellow streetlights cast pools on wet asphalt. Mark pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment. The car clicked as it cooled. Through the kitchen window, he could see Susan moving around inside. At 62, she still folded laundry with careful precision. He grabbed his lunch pail and walked up the front steps. Warm air wrapped around him as he pushed open the door. Hey, he called out. Susan looked up from the dining table. Papers covered the wobbly surface. Bills, receipts, mail scattered everywhere. Her reading glasses sat low on her nose. How was work? She asked. Same as always. Mark dropped his lunch pail on the kitchen chair. The metal clanged against wood. Broken pipes. Nothing I couldn't handle. He opened the refrigerator and pulled out a glass of water. Ice cubes clinked. Susan continued folding towels, but her movements seemed rushed. Nervous. The heater clicked on. Mark's pill organizer sat beside the sink. 7 plastic compartments filled with white tablets that kept his heart steady. You okay? Mark asked. Susan's hands paused over a dish towel. She smoothed it flat, then folded it again. I'm fine, she said too quickly. Just tired. Mark studied her face. Susan had always been easy to read. Tonight, she kept glancing toward the front window, toward the mailbox, then back to her laundry. Something was different. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Mark woke to the newspaper hitting the front porch. Susan was already up, coffee brewing. The smell filled the kitchen. Mail come yet? Mark asked. Susan shook her head. She poured coffee into his favorite mug, the one with the faded hospital logo. Steam rose from the dark surface. The mailman arrived at 11. Mark heard the truck's engine rumble to a stop. The mailbox lid squeaked open, then clanged shut. Susan reached the door first. She gathered the mail quickly. Her fingers moved fast through the envelopes. Bills from the electric company. A grocery store circular. A catalog for gardening supplies. Then Mark saw the thick envelope. Medicare. The blue logo was unmistakable. Susan's hand trembled as she picked it up. The paper felt stiff between her fingers. Heavier than usual. She turned it over, then back again. "Give me that," she said, reaching for it. Mark held the envelope up to the light. The return address was clear. Medicare benefits. His name was typed across the front in block letters. "It's mine," he said. Susan's voice was softer than her grip. "Give me that." Mark tore open the envelope. The explanation of benefits was thicker than normal. 3 pages instead of 1. He unfolded the papers and scanned the first line. "Outpatient procedure," he read aloud. "February 3rd. His finger traced the line item. The date was 2 weeks ago. The procedure code meant nothing to him. But the location did. Cincinnati Medical Center. 2 hours away. "I was never there," Mark said. Susan's robe sleeve trembled as she reached for the papers. "Let me see." Mark pulled the EOB closer to his chest. "Why would Medicare think I had surgery in Cincinnati? Old people mail is always wrong." The voice came from behind them. Kara drifted into the kitchen with vape-sweet perfume and a phone glued to her face. At 32, Susan's daughter moved through the world like she was underwater. Slow and dreamy, she saw the EOB and froze for half a second. Then forced a laugh that sounded too bright. "I mean, you know how computers mess up everything." Kara's thumb tapped her phone screen like a metronome. She didn't look at Mark. Her eyes stayed fixed on the glowing rectangle in her palm. "This isn't a computer error," Mark said. "Someone used my Medicare number." Kara shrugged. She let the screen door slam behind her as she drifted back outside. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. Mark opened the kitchen drawer where he kept important papers. His Medicare card should be right on top, beside his Social Security card and emergency contact list. He pushed aside expired coupons and rubber bands. Found old grocery receipts and a broken pen. His Medicare card was shoved behind everything else, slightly bent as if someone had handled it in a hurry. "Why is my card down there?" Mark asked. Susan's eyes dropped to the floor. "I was just organizing." Mark slid the card out. The plastic was warm from the drawer. The corner was creased where someone had gripped it too tight. He held it up to the light and saw fingerprints on the surface. "When did you organize this?" he asked. Susan turned away. She started folding the same towel again. Her movements were sharp now. Angry. Mark reached for his Social Security statement on the counter. The one he always kept near the landline for easy reference. The paper felt different in his hands. Lighter. He held it up and saw a corner torn off. The section with his full account number was missing. Just gone. "Did something happen to this?" Mark asked. Susan's jaw tightened. "Stop interrogating me." The words hung in the air between them. Susan looked shocked at herself, like the anger had escaped without permission. "I'm not interrogating," Mark said quietly. "I'm asking." Susan's hands shook as she folded the towel. Once, twice, 3 times. The fabric became a small, tight square in her lap. "Something's wrong," Mark said. Rain began to tick against the window. Soft at first, then harder. The sound grew until it filled the silence between them. "Susan, tell me the truth," Mark said. "Who touched my mail?" The room went still. Even the heater stopped cycling. Susan stared at the folded towel in her hands like it might have answers. "I told you," she whispered. "I was organizing." But Mark heard the lie in the pause after the word. He heard it in the way her voice caught on the syllables. He heard it in the silence that followed. That night, Mark lay awake listening to the refrigerator cycle. The distant siren down Wilmington Pike. The rain against the bedroom window. Susan's phone lit up beside the bed. The blue glow painted the ceiling for a moment before she grabbed it and tilted the screen away. "Who's texting this late?" Mark asked. "It's nothing," Susan whispered. But Mark saw her thumbs moving across the screen. Fast, urgent taps like she was having a conversation. The phone buzzed again. Then again. "Susan?" She set the phone face down on the nightstand. The room went dark again. "Go to sleep," she said. Mark closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The Medicare EOB was still on the kitchen table. The bent Medicare card was still in the drawer. His Social Security statement was still missing a corner. And Susan's phone kept buzzing in the dark. Monday morning came with gray sky and empty coffee cups. Mark drove to the pharmacy after his shift, the Medicare EOB folded in his jacket pocket like evidence he wasn't ready to use. Walgreens smelled like disinfectant and floor wax. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Mark approached the prescription counter and gave his name to the cashier. Ellison, the young woman repeated, typing into her computer. Heart medication? That's right. She frowned at the screen. Your copay today is $47. Mark's hand tightened on the counter. That's not right. It's usually $15. The cashier shrugged. Insurance changed, sir. Computer shows different coverage. Mark pulled out his wallet. The bills felt thin between his fingers. He counted out $47 and watched his medication disappear into a white paper bag. When did it change? He asked. I just ring it up, the cashier said. You'd have to call Medicare. Mark drove home with questions piling up like snow. The medication bag sat on the passenger seat. $47, more than 3 times the usual amount. At home, Susan was washing dishes. Her back was turned when Mark walked in. Steam rose from the sink. They charged me $47, Mark said. Susan's shoulders tensed. For what? My heart medication. Said my insurance changed. Susan turned off the water. She dried her hands on a dish towel without turning around. Maybe you should call them, she said. Mark set the medication bag on the kitchen table. The Medicare phone number was printed on the back of his card. He dialed and put the phone on speaker. The automated voice began its loop. Thank you for calling Medicare. Your call is important to us. Mark tapped his pencil against a notepad. Susan hovered behind him, folding a dish towel so tight her knuckles went pale. Press 1 for claims information, the voice continued. Press 2 for coverage changes. Mark pressed 2. The hold music began. Instrumental jazz that made him feel like he was stuck in an elevator. Para Español, presiona tres, the voice said. I just want to talk to a person, Mark muttered. Susan folded the towel again. Her movements were quick and nervous. She kept glancing toward Kara's bedroom door. After 15 minutes, a representative finally answered. Medicare customer service, this is Jennifer. How can I help you? My copay tripled, Mark said. I need to know why my coverage changed. Can I have your Medicare number, please? Mark read the numbers from his card. He could hear Jennifer typing on the other end. I see here that claims were filed under your member ID, Jennifer said. Recent outpatient procedures in Cincinnati and Columbus. Mark's pencil stopped moving. I was never in Columbus. The claims show dates in February, Jennifer continued. Outpatient surgery and follow-up care. Someone's using my number fraudulently. You'll need to file a fraud report, sir. I can transfer you to that department. The hold music started again. Mark looked at Susan. Her face had gone pale. Who would have my Medicare number? Mark asked. Susan didn't answer. She walked to the window and stared outside. The fraud department put Mark on hold for another 20 minutes. When someone finally answered, they asked for the same information all over again. We'll open an investigation, the representative said. You should receive a letter in 10 business days. Mark hung up and sat back in his chair. The kitchen felt too quiet. 10 business days, he said. Susan was still at the window. Maybe it's just a mistake. Someone had my card, Susan. Someone who knew my information. Susan turned around. Her eyes were rimmed with red. Why are you looking at me like that? I'm not looking at you anyway. You think I did something. Mark set his pencil down. I think someone in this house knows more than they're saying. The argument was interrupted by the mail truck. Mark heard it rumble to a stop outside. Susan rushed to the door before Mark could move. She came back with a handful of envelopes. Bills, mostly, but one letter stood out. Social Security Administration. Official government seal. Mark tore it open and read the first paragraph twice. My monthly deposit is being reduced, he said. Susan sat down hard in her chair. Reduced why? Says here there was an updated direct deposit request. Someone changed my banking information. Mark's hands shook as he read the letter again. I didn't change anything. Susan's voice was barely a whisper. Maybe there's been a mistake. 2 mistakes in 1 week? Medicare fraud and Social Security changes? Mark stood up and walked to the landline. He dialed the SSA customer service number printed on the letter. The automated system was even worse than Medicare's. Social Security Administration, a voice finally answered. This is Robert. How can I help you? Someone changed my direct deposit information without my permission. Can I have your Social Security number, please? Mark recited the digits. Robert typed for what felt like an hour. I see here that we received an updated direct deposit form, Robert said. A power of attorney document is on file. Mark's grip tightened on the phone. I never signed a power of attorney. The document was submitted electronically with proper authorization. What kind of authorization? I'm not able to provide those details over the phone, sir. You'd need to visit a local office. Mark hung up and looked at Susan. She was crying now, quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks. A power of attorney, Mark said. Someone forged my signature. Susan's phone buzzed on the table. She grabbed it quickly and read the message. Her face went even paler. Who's texting you? Mark asked. Nobody. Susan, show me the phone. It's nothing. The phone buzzed again. Susan clutched it against her chest. Mark drove to the Social Security office the next morning. The building was gray concrete with small windows. Inside, plastic chairs squeaked under fluorescent lights. The waiting room was full of tired people holding manila folders. Mark took a number and sat down. 47 ahead of him. When his number was finally called, a clerk led him to a small office. The woman behind the desk looked like she'd seen every kind of trouble. I'm here about unauthorized changes to my account, Mark said. The clerk typed Mark's information into her computer. Her fingers moved fast across the keyboard. I see the power of attorney document, she said. Filed 2 weeks ago. I never signed anything. The clerk turned her monitor toward Mark. On the screen was a scanned document. His signature was at the bottom, but something about it looked wrong. Can I get a copy of this? Mark asked. Certainly. The clerk hit print, and the machine hummed to life. Mark studied the signature. It was close, but not quite right. The M in Mark was too round. The E in Ellison had an extra loop. Who submitted this document? Mark asked. I'm not able to provide that information. You'd need to file a formal complaint. Mark drove home with the forged power of attorney burning a hole in his jacket pocket. The signature was good enough to fool a computer, but not good enough to fool him. At home, Susan was cleaning the kitchen. She moved like she was trying to stay busy, scrubbing counters that were already clean. I got a copy of the power of attorney, Mark said. Susan stopped scrubbing. And? The signature's fake. Susan's sponge dripped soapy water onto the floor. How can you tell? Because I know how I sign my name. Mark pulled out the document and spread it on the table. Susan looked at it for a long moment. Maybe your signatures change, she said. People's handwriting changes as they get older. Not that much. Susan picked up her sponge and went back to cleaning. But Mark noticed her hands were shaking. That afternoon, Mark tried to use the landline and heard nothing. No dial tone, just silence. He checked the connection behind the phone. Everything looked normal. He tried unplugging it and plugging it back in. Still nothing. Phone's dead, he announced. Susan was in the living room, folding laundry. I know. Service got cut off. Cut off why? Bill wasn't paid. Mark walked to the stack of bills on the kitchen table. Found the phone bill from last month. $63. Not a fortune, but not pocket change either. I can pay $63, Mark said. I'll handle it, Susan said quickly. I just forgot. But Mark noticed Kara's phone was working fine. He could hear it ringing from her bedroom. Over and over. She never answered. That evening, Mark tried to log into his bank account online. His laptop was slow, but it eventually loaded the login page. He typed his username and password. The screen showed an error message, unrecognized device. Please verify your identity. Mark had been using the same laptop for 2 years. It should be recognized. He scrolled down to the trusted devices section. His laptop was listed, but so was something else. An iPad registered 3 weeks ago. Why is there an iPad on my account? Mark called out. Kara's voice came from her bedroom. I don't know. Stop blaming me for everything. Mark stared at the screen. The iPad had been used to access his account 17 times in the past month. Always late at night. Always after Mark had gone to bed. He clicked on the device details. The iPad had been used to view his Social Security direct deposit information. His Medicare benefits summary. His account balances. Someone's been watching my accounts, Mark said. Susan appeared in the doorway. What are you talking about? Mark pointed at the screen. This iPad. Someone's been using it to monitor my finances. Susan squinted at the laptop. Maybe it's a mistake. How do you mistake registering a new device? Susan didn't answer. She just stood there looking guilty. That night, Mark lay in bed listening to the house settle. Susan pretended to be asleep, but he could feel her tension through the mattress. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Soft, careful steps trying not to wake anyone. Mark got up quietly and looked out the bedroom door. Kara was walking toward the garage. She was carrying something in her hand. Something that glowed. Mark heard the garage door keypad beep. Once, then twice. Like someone entering a code. He stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the cold draft under the garage door. Wondering what secrets were being practiced in the dark. When Kara came back inside, Mark pretended to be asleep. But he stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the pieces. Medicare fraud, Social Security changes, forged documents, dead landlines, registered devices. The pattern was there. He just couldn't see it clearly yet. But he was starting to understand that the house was no longer his refuge. Someone was erasing him from his own life. One document at a time. Wednesday morning brought no answers, only more questions. Mark sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and the growing pile of evidence. Medicare EOBs, the forged power of attorney. Bank statements showing the mysterious iPad access. Susan was washing dishes again. She'd been washing dishes a lot lately. The same plates, over and over. Kara emerged from her bedroom around noon, phone already attached to her ear. She wore yesterday's clothes and moved with the sluggish confidence of someone who'd slept till noon without consequences. She grabbed a Diet Coke from the refrigerator and leaned against the counter. Mark noticed she was watching him over the phone, her eyes darting between him and the papers on the table. I gotta go, Kara said into the phone. She hung up and looked directly at Susan. Mom, we need to talk. Susan turned off the water. About what? Kara glanced at Mark, then back at Susan. Privately. Anything you need to say, you can say in front of me, Mark said. Kara's laugh was sharp and bitter. I don't think so. She walked to the table and stood behind Susan's chair. Close enough to whisper, but she didn't lower her voice. He's been going through my things, Kara said. Mark set down his coffee cup. That's not true. My laptop was moved. My papers were out of order. Kara's voice gained strength with each word. He's been in my room. Susan turned around in her chair. Mark, is that true? Of course not. Mark looked between them. Susan, you know I wouldn't do that. But Kara was warming up now. She pulled out her phone and held it up like evidence. I have proof, she said. He's been checking my accounts online. Following my activity. Mark's throat tightened. What are you talking about? Bank alerts. Someone's been logging into my accounts from this address. Kara's voice trembled in the practiced way that fear can sound convincing. Someone's been watching me. Susan's protective instincts kicked in. Mark could see it happen. Her shoulders straightened. Her breath became sharp and defensive. Why would she lie about that? Susan asked. Mark felt the room tilt. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Because the answer was ugly and complicated. Because admitting the answer meant admitting that Kara was capable of elaborate deception. And Kara used that silence like a weapon. He's unstable, she said. The word dropped into the kitchen like a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward, changing everything they touched. Susan flinched. Actually flinched, as if the word had physical force. Mark watched his wife look at him with new eyes. The eyes of someone reconsidering 30 years of marriage in the space of a single syllable. Susan, Mark said carefully. You know me. But Kara wasn't finished. She was just getting started. Look at him, she said, pointing without making eye contact. Look how he's watching us. Like we're the enemy. Mark realized his hands were clenched. He forced them to relax. But the damage was done. Susan had seen the tension. The anger he was trying to control. I'm not watching anyone, Mark said. I'm trying to figure out who's using my Medicare card. Kara snatched the EOB from the table. She folded it quickly and shoved it into Susan's robe pocket, covering the claim number with her thumb. Those are computer errors, Kara said. But this, she gestured at Mark. This is real behavior. Mark reached for the EOB. Let me see that. Don't touch me, Kara said, stepping backward. She hadn't actually moved away from his hand. But she said it loud enough for Susan to hear. Loud enough to plant the image of Mark as someone who might grab. Someone who might force. Susan stood up between them. Mark, just stop. Stop what? I haven't done anything. You're scaring her. Mark looked at his wife. Really looked at her. Susan's face was flushed. Her breathing was fast and shallow. She believed Kara. Not about everything, maybe. But about enough. I'm not scaring anyone, Mark said. I'm asking questions about my own money. My own accounts. Your accounts? Kara laughed. Mom pays all the bills. Mom handles everything. You just work and complain. The words stung because they contained a grain of truth. Mark did work. He did let Susan handle most of the paperwork. But that was trust, not neglect. Wasn't it? I've never complained about working, Mark said quietly. You complain about everything else. Kara was building momentum now. The house is too cold. The food's too expensive. Nothing's ever good enough. Mark felt the ground shifting under his feet. These weren't lies exactly. They were truths twisted into weapons. Yes, he'd mentioned the heating bill. Yes, he'd questioned some expenses. But those were conversations, not complaints. I've never said anything wasn't good enough, Mark said. Susan's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. You question everything I do. Mark turned to look at his wife. I question bills that don't make sense. I question charges I don't recognize. You question me, Susan said, and there were tears in her eyes now. Mark felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, exactly. Something more fundamental. The assumption that the people who loved him would know the difference between curiosity and criticism. I trusted you, Mark said. Both of you. With everything. Kara made a sound of disgust. Trust? You've been going through our private things. Checking our accounts. Following us around like some kind of stalker. That's not true. Then explain the bank alerts. Explain why my laptop was moved. Explain why you keep asking the same questions over and over. Mark couldn't explain those things because he'd never done them. But Kara's confidence was absolute. Her details were specific. And Susan was looking at him like she wasn't sure anymore. Maybe you forgot, Susan said gently. Maybe you don't remember checking those things. The implication hit Mark like a punch to the stomach. Susan thought he was losing his memory. Thought he was becoming the kind of old man who forgot his own actions and then denied them. I'm not senile, Mark said. Nobody said you were, Kara said quickly. But you're acting paranoid. And paranoid people do things they don't remember. Mark looked around the kitchen. At the evidence he'd gathered. At the bills and statements that proved someone was using his identity. At his wife's tear-stained face and her daughter's righteous indignation. And he realized that none of it mattered. The proof didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. Because Kara had done something much more devastating than steal his Medicare number. She'd stolen his credibility. Get out, Susan said. The words came out as a scream that didn't sound like her voice. Raw and desperate and final. Susan, get out of my house. The sound ricocheted off the tile walls and fluorescent light fixture. It filled the small kitchen and spilled into the hallway and living room beyond. Mark grabbed his work jacket from the chair. His keys from the counter. His worn leather wallet from beside the coffee maker. The motions were automatic, like a man evacuating a burning building. The wind shoved rain sideways through the open door. Cold air flooded the kitchen. You don't belong here anymore, Susan said, and Mark stepped into the storm without looking back. He sat in his car in the driveway for a long time. The windows fogged with his breath. Rain drummed against the roof. He could see Kara and Susan through the kitchen window, talking in urgent whispers. His phone rang. Dayton Police Department, a voice said. We've received a domestic disturbance call. We just need to ask a few questions. Mark's hands were steady as he answered. Ask away. Are you Mark Ellison? Yes. Are you currently at 1247 Briarwood Drive? I'm sitting in my driveway. Is your name the only one on the deed to that property? Mark paused. He remembered Susan saying, years ago, that she didn't want her name on the deed. Something about protecting her credit after the bankruptcy. At the time, it had seemed wise. Now it felt like a trap that had taken years to close. Yes, Mark said. My name is the only one on the deed. The silence on the other end of the line felt heavy with consequences he was only beginning to understand. Sir, we're going to need you to stay away from the property for tonight. Someone will contact you tomorrow about next steps. Mark hung up and started the car. The heat slowly cleared the windshield fog. He could see the house clearly now. Lights on in every room. His house, legally speaking. But not his home anymore. Not his family anymore. He drove through the rain toward his brother Ron's place, wondering when caring about the truth had become a crime punishable by exile. Ron's couch smelled like sawdust and Old Spice cologne. Mark had been sleeping on it for 3 days, his back aching from the sagging cushions. The living room was small and cluttered with woodworking magazines and empty beer cans. "You can stay as long as you need," Ron had said. But Mark heard the question underneath the offer. How long would that be? Thursday morning arrived gray and bitter. Mark spread his papers across Ron's kitchen table like a man trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Medicare EOBs, bank statements, the forged power of attorney. Each document felt important, but together they told a story he still couldn't quite believe. His phone buzzed with a bank alert. Mark opened the app and watched his stomach drop. His Social Security deposit had been reduced by $300. The automated message was cheerful and matter-of-fact, "Your direct deposit has been updated according to your recent authorization." Mark's pill organizer rattled in his shaking hand. Thursday's compartment held 2 small white tablets. The medication that kept his heart rhythm steady. He dry swallowed them and tasted bitter chalk. "I'm not a burden," he whispered to the empty kitchen. But the words didn't convince him. $300. That was groceries for a month. Gas money. The small cushion that made the difference between comfortable and desperate. Ron emerged from the back bedroom, work clothes already on. "You okay?" Mark showed him the phone screen. "They cut my Social Security." Ron squinted at the numbers. At 68, Ron needed reading glasses but refused to wear them. "How's that legal?" "Someone forged documents. Changed my banking information." Ron poured coffee into a travel mug. "What are you going to do?" Mark stared at the phone screen. "I don't know." The answer sounded pathetic even to himself. 3 days ago, he'd been a man with a house, a wife, and a simple life. Now he was sleeping on his brother's couch, questioning his own memory, and watching strangers dismantle his finances from the inside. "I could lend you," Ron started. "No." Mark's voice was sharper than he intended. "I'm not borrowing money. Not yet." Ron nodded and headed for the door. "Lunch is in the fridge if you want it." Mark spent the morning on hold with various government agencies. Social Security put him through 4 transfers before telling him to visit a local office. Medicare required him to file paperwork that wouldn't arrive for 10 business days. Everyone was sorry for his inconvenience. Nobody could fix anything immediately. At noon, the mail arrived. Ron's postal carrier left a small pile on the front porch. Bills for Ron, mostly. But one envelope was addressed to Mark, forwarded from Briarwood Drive. The return address made his chest tighten. County Assessor's Office. Official business. Mark tore open the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The header read, "Notice of Delinquent Property Tax." His house was behind on property tax payments. $2,000 behind. The notice was friendly but firm: pay immediately or face foreclosure proceedings. Mark read the notice 3 times. The tax bill had been mailed to Briarwood Drive. Someone should have received it. Someone should have paid it. He called the assessor's office from Ron's landline. "Property Tax Department," a bored voice answered. "I received a delinquency notice. I need to understand why my taxes weren't paid." "Property address?" 1247 Briarwood Drive. Mark heard typing. "Shows here the tax bill was mailed in November. We sent 2 follow-up notices. No response. I never received any notices. They were mailed to the property address. That's standard procedure." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "What if mail isn't being forwarded properly?" "That's between you and the Postal Service, sir. We just need payment within 10 days or we proceed with foreclosure." $2,000. Mark didn't have $2,000. Not anymore. Not with the reduced Social Security and the missing Medicare benefits. He hung up and walked to Ron's front window. Through the glass, he could see neighbors going about their normal Thursday routines. A woman walking her dog. A man loading groceries from his car. Normal people living normal lives where mail got delivered and taxes got paid and family members didn't forge documents. That evening, Mark drove past Briarwood Drive. He didn't plan to stop. He just wanted to see the house. To remind himself it was real. The porch light was on. Susan's car was in the driveway. But there were other cars too. A red Toyota he didn't recognize. A black SUV with out-of-state plates. Music thumped through the walls loud enough to hear from the street. Bass that made his car windows vibrate. Mark parked 3 houses down and watched. Through the kitchen window, he could see people moving around. Laughing, dancing, living like they owned the place. Kara's silhouette appeared in the front window. She was holding a drink in one hand and her phone in the other. Her movements were loose and careless. The movements of someone celebrating. "They're living like I never existed," Mark whispered. The words hung in the cold air inside his car. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, fighting the urge to walk up to the front door and demand answers. But the police had been clear. Stay away from the property. Someone will contact you about next steps. Nobody had contacted him about anything. Mark drove back to Ron's place and sat in the driveway for a long time. The porch light was on, warm and welcoming. But it wasn't his porch. It wasn't his light. He was homeless, not in the technical sense Ron had given him shelter, but in the deeper sense that mattered. He had no place that belonged to him. No space where his presence was assumed and welcome. Inside, Mark opened his laptop and navigated to the county recorder's website. Public records were available online. He searched for 1247 Briarwood Drive and waited for the results to load. A PDF appeared on his screen. Warranty deed. The document was formal and official, full of legal language that made his head hurt. But the important part was clear: Mark Allen Ellison, a single man, as sole owner. Sole owner. Mark read those words 3 times. The house was his. Legally, completely, undisputedly his. So why was he sitting in his brother's driveway while strangers partied in his living room? The answer was complicated and humiliating. Because ownership meant nothing when the people you loved turned against you. Because documents and deeds couldn't protect you from betrayal by the ones you trusted most. Mark closed the laptop and sat in the dark car, listening to his own breathing. For the first time in 3 days, he felt something other than confusion and hurt. He felt angry. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that led to shouting matches and broken dishes. The cold, steady kind that burned like a pilot light. The kind that could sustain itself for as long as necessary. "No," Mark said out loud. His voice surprised him. It was steady, determined. It was the voice of a man who had remembered something important about himself. "This is not how this ends." Mark pulled out his phone and Googled, "elder law attorney Dayton, Ohio." The first result was a woman named Diane Keller. Her photo showed a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a professional smile. Her office hours were listed. 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. Mark looked at his watch. 7:30 p.m. Too late to call tonight. But not too late to make a decision. Mark scrolled through Diane Keller's website. Client testimonials. Areas of practice. Elder financial abuse. Medicare fraud. Family disputes. "I don't know what I'm doing," Mark said to his reflection in the phone screen. But maybe that was okay. Maybe not knowing what you're doing was different from giving up. Maybe asking for help was different from admitting defeat. Mark saved Diane Keller's number in his contacts. Tomorrow morning, he would call. Tonight, he would sleep on Ron's couch one more time. But not because he had nowhere else to go. Because he was gathering strength for what came next. The pilot light in his chest burned a little brighter. Not much, but enough. Enough to remind him that Mark Ellison wasn't dead yet. And as long as he wasn't dead, he wasn't defeated. The house on Briarwood Drive was his. The bank accounts were his. The social security number was his. It was time to start acting like it. Friday morning, Mark called Diane Keller from Ron's back porch. The cold air helped him think clearly. His breath came out in white puffs as he waited for someone to answer. "Keller Law Offices," a receptionist said. "I need to speak with Diane Keller about financial elder abuse. Can I have your name?" "Mark Ellison." "Hold please." Mark waited, watching a cardinal pick at the bird feeder in Ron's backyard. Red against bare brown branches. A splash of color in the gray February morning. "This is Diane Keller." Her voice was calm and professional. Not the impatient tone Mark had expected from a busy attorney. "Ms. Keller, I think someone's been using my identity. Medicare fraud. Social security changes. I don't know what I'm doing." "Start by telling me the boring parts," Diane said. That's where the truth usually hides. Mark found himself telling her everything. The Medicare EOBs, the forged power of attorney, the property tax notice, Kara's accusations, Susan's betrayal. How long have you been married? Diane asked. 31 years. Children together? No. Kara is Susan's daughter from her first marriage. Diane was quiet for a moment. Mark could hear her typing. The house deed is in your name only? Yes. Susan's name isn't on it. Why not? Mark remembered that conversation from 12 years ago. Susan sitting at the same dining table where she now sorted mail and folded laundry. Papers spread everywhere. Bankruptcy documents, credit card statements, the debris of a financial life that had fallen apart. Susan had been crying, not the angry tears that came with frustration, but the exhausted tears that came with surrender. I don't want to ruin your credit, she had said. Mark had made coffee and sat beside her. The steam from their mugs mixed together in the cold kitchen air. It's not your fault, Mark had told her. The divorce lawyer took everything. The medical bills finished it. Susan's first husband had left her with nothing but debt. Kara had been 15 then, angry and confused. The three of them had moved into Mark's small house like refugees from a war nobody talked about. We'll fix it, Mark had said. But your name stays off the deed for now. Just for safety. Susan had nodded, wiping her eyes with a dish towel. Just for safety. At the time, it had seemed like protection. A way to shield Susan from creditors who might come after the house. Mark remembered feeling generous, noble, even. My wife had credit problems, Mark told Diane. We kept the deed separate to protect the house. How long ago was this? 12 years. And the credit problems were resolved? Mark paused. He'd never actually checked. Susan handled the bills, managed their accounts. He assumed things had gotten better. I don't know, Mark admitted. We'll need to find out, Diane said. Can you come in this afternoon? 2 o'clock? Yes. Bring everything. Every document, every statement, every notice. Even if it seems unimportant. Mark spent the next hour organizing his papers. The stack was thicker than he'd realized. Medicare EOBs going back 6 months. Bank statements showing the mysterious iPad access. Phone bills and utility notices forwarded from the house. At Diane's office, Mark spread everything across a conference table. Diane was younger than he'd expected, maybe 50, with graying hair and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She studied each document carefully, making notes on a yellow legal pad. These Medicare claims, she said, pointing to the EOBs. The procedures were done in Cincinnati and Columbus. I've never been to either place for medical care. But someone would need your Medicare card and personal information to file these claims. Mark nodded. The card was in my kitchen drawer. Anyone in the house could have accessed it. Diane pulled up something on her computer. I'm running a credit report tied to your social security number. The printer hummed to life. Pages emerged covered with small print and numbers. This is interesting, Diane said, scanning the report. There are multiple accounts opened in your name. Store credit cards. A personal loan. All at your address. Mark's stomach tightened. I didn't open those. I know. But look at the timing. Diane spread the credit report pages next to the Medicare EOBs. The patterns were clear when laid out side by side. The identity theft started small, she explained. Medical claims first. Low risk, easy money. Then credit accounts. Then the social security changes. Why escalate? Because small fraud became insufficient. Or because time was running out. Mark leaned forward. Running out how? Diane pointed to a date circled on her legal pad. The police call you received. When was that? Wednesday night. And when did the social security changes happen? Mark checked his phone. Tuesday morning. Someone moved fast after the domestic disturbance call. Why? Mark thought about that night. The shouting. The accusations. Kara's performance of fear. If I moved back into the house, Mark said slowly, I would have seen the bills. The statements. The evidence. Exactly. If you reconciled with your wife and resumed normal financial oversight, the fraud would be exposed. Mark felt something cold settle in his stomach. She didn't want me gone. She needed me gone. Diane nodded. The domestic disturbance call wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Mark stared at the documents spread across the table. The evidence of a plan that had been months in the making. The Medicare fraud to establish a pattern. The credit accounts to generate cash. The domestic crisis to remove the threat of discovery. How long do you think this has been going on? Mark asked. Diane flipped through the credit report. Based on the account opening dates, at least 6 months. Maybe longer. 6 months. Mark tried to remember Susan's behavior over that time. The nervous energy. The way she jumped when the phone rang. The constant laundry folding. She knew, Mark said. Or she was threatened into cooperation. Mark wanted to believe that. Wanted to think Susan was a victim too. But he remembered her scream in the kitchen. The way she'd looked at him like he was a stranger. What do I do now? Mark asked. Document everything. File formal complaints with Medicare and Social Security. Freeze your credit. And most importantly, Diane looked at him directly, do not confront them. Why not? Because they're already claiming you're unstable. Any confrontation will be used as evidence against you. Mark gathered his papers, feeling the weight of the folder in his hands. How long will this take? Weeks. Maybe months. These cases move slowly. I can't stay on my brother's couch for months. The house is legally yours. We can file for exclusive occupancy. Mark looked up from his papers. What does that mean? It means you have the right to live in your own home. Even if other people don't want you there. For the first time in days, Mark felt something that might have been hope. Can they stop me? They can try, but ownership has its privileges. Mark stood to leave, then paused at the door. Ms. Keller? Why would someone do this to family? Diane's answer was gentle but unflinching. Because family has access. And because family is trusted. Mark drove back to Ron's place with Diane's words echoing in his head. The afternoon sun was weak but present. The cardinal was still at the bird feeder, bright red against the winter sky. Inside, Mark spread his papers on Ron's kitchen table one more time. But now they looked different. Not like evidence of confusion, but like proof of crime. His phone buzzed with a text message from Susan, "We need to talk." Mark stared at the screen until it went dark. Then he set the phone face down on the table like a boundary. Diane's instructions were simple: silence is not weakness. It's strategy. For the first time in his adult life, Mark chose not to respond to his wife immediately. Not out of anger, but out of something more powerful. Self-preservation. Monday morning, Mark walked into First National Bank carrying a folder so thick it required both hands. The lobby smelled like carpet cleaner and fresh coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. "I need to speak with a manager," Mark told the teller. "What's this regarding?" "Identity theft. Unauthorized device access to my accounts." The teller's expression shifted from polite to concerned. "I'll get someone right away." Mark waited in a small office with glass walls. Through the window, he could see other customers conducting normal banking business. Depositing checks. Opening savings accounts. Simple transactions between honest people. "Mr. Ellison?" A woman in a navy suit extended her hand. "I'm Carol Martinez, branch manager." Mark shook her hand and opened his folder. "Someone registered an iPad to access my accounts. I never authorized it." Carol sat behind her desk and pulled up Mark's account on her computer. "When did you first notice the unauthorized access?" "Last week. The device was registered 3 weeks ago." Carol typed rapidly, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. "I see the iPad registration here. Initiated through your online portal. I don't have an iPad. But the login came from your home IP address." Mark felt his jaw tighten. "Someone in my household registered it without my knowledge." Carol nodded. She'd clearly dealt with family financial abuse before. "We can freeze any devices you didn't authorize. Do you have a secure location for future banking?" "My brother's house. For now. I'll update your address and freeze the iPad immediately. You'll need to create new login credentials." Mark watched Carol work, her fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard. Each click felt like a small victory. A piece of his life being returned to his control. "The iPad was used to access your Social Security direct deposit information," Carol said. "And to view your Medicare account summaries. Gathering information." "Exactly. We see this pattern in elder financial abuse cases. The perpetrator maps out all accounts before making changes." Mark left the bank with new login credentials and a printed summary of all iPad activity. 17 unauthorized accesses over 3 weeks. Each one carefully documented with timestamps and specific pages viewed. Evidence. Next stop was the Social Security office. Mark arrived early and took a number. The waiting room was crowded with tired people clutching manila folders. When his number was called, Mark was led to the same small office he'd visited the week before. The clerk recognized him. "Back about the power of attorney?" she asked. "I want to file a formal fraud report." Mark spread the forged document on her desk. "This signature isn't mine." The clerk examined it closely. "How can you prove that?" Mark pulled out his driver's license, his Medicare card, and a recent check he'd signed. "Compare them." The clerk laid the documents side by side. Even Mark could see the differences. The forged signature was close but imperfect. The M in Mark was too round. The E in Ellison had an extra loop. "I'll need you to fill out these forms," the clerk said, handing him a thick packet. "And we'll need an official handwriting analysis." "How long does that take?" 6 to 8 weeks for the investigation. Another 4 weeks to reverse any changes. Mark's heart sank. 3 months? Fraud investigations move slowly, but we'll put a hold on any further changes to your account. Mark spent an hour filling out forms. Personal information, timeline of events, details about who had access to his documents. When he finished, the clerk reviewed everything carefully. "One more thing," she said. "You'll need to file a police report. We require that for all fraud cases." At the police station, Mark was assigned to Detective Sarah Kim. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and graying temples. "Elder financial abuse," she said, reviewing his paperwork. "We see more of these every year. My stepdaughter accused me of being unstable, then used that accusation to justify taking over my finances." Detective Kim nodded. "Classic isolation technique. Discredit the victim, then exploit the confusion." She pulled up something on her computer. "I see we have a domestic disturbance call from your address last week. That was orchestrated. Part of the plan to remove me from the house. Can you prove that?" Mark opened his folder and showed her the timeline Diane had helped him create. Medicare fraud dates. Credit account opening dates. The domestic disturbance call. Everything mapped out on a single sheet of paper. "The timing is suspicious," Detective Kim admitted. "But suspicion isn't evidence. What kind of evidence do you need?" "Confession. Recorded admission. Financial records showing diversion of funds." Mark left the police station feeling deflated. The detective was sympathetic but realistic. Proving family financial abuse was difficult when the perpetrators lived in the victim's house. That afternoon, Mark returned to Diane's office. "How did it go?" she asked. "Everyone believes me. Nobody can help me immediately." Diane spread his documents across the conference table again. "That's normal. The system is designed to prevent false accusations, which means legitimate cases move slowly." "How slowly?" "Months. But we don't have to wait months to get you back in your house." Diane pulled up a legal document on her computer. "Exclusive occupancy order. Since you're the sole owner, you have the right to live there." "Even with the restraining order?" "The police advised you to stay away temporarily. That's different from a formal court order." Mark felt a spark of hope. "When can we file?" "Today." "But Mark," Diane looked at him seriously, "this will escalate things. They'll fight back. I'm tired of being the only one following the rules." Diane printed the forms and Mark signed them carefully. His real signature, not the forged version someone had used to steal his Social Security. "The sheriff will serve this tomorrow," Diane said. "Be ready for resistance." That evening, Mark drove past the house on Briarwood Drive. The porch light was on, but the loud music had stopped. Susan's car was in the driveway. Kara's red Toyota was parked on the lawn. Mark pulled over 2 houses down and turned off his engine. Through the kitchen window, he could see Susan washing dishes. The same ritual she'd been performing for weeks. His phone rang. "Mark?" Susan's voice was shaky. "We need to talk." Mark could see her through the window, phone pressed to her ear. She looked older somehow, more fragile. "We need money for groceries," Susan continued. "And the utilities are due." Mark listened to his wife ask for money to pay bills for his own house. The house he legally owned but couldn't enter. The utilities that powered the lights he could see but couldn't use. "My lawyer will contact you," Mark said. The words felt strange in his mouth. Formal, final, not the way he'd ever imagined speaking to Susan. "Your lawyer?" Susan's voice cracked. "Mark, what's happened to us?" Mark wanted to answer. Wanted to explain about the Medicare fraud and the forged documents and the cruel precision of Kara's manipulation. Wanted to make Susan understand that he wasn't the enemy. But Diane's voice was clear in his memory: do not confront. Document everything. Goodbye, Susan, Mark said. He hung up and watched through the window as Susan held the silent phone to her ear. She looked confused, lost, like a woman who'd expected one conversation and received another. Mark started his car and drove away. In his rearview mirror, he could see Susan still standing at the kitchen window. Still holding the phone, still waiting for him to call back and make everything normal again. But normal was gone. Normal had been an illusion built on trust and assumptions. Normal was what happened when families didn't forge documents and steal identities and orchestrate domestic crises. Tomorrow, the sheriff would serve the exclusive occupancy order. Tomorrow, Mark would have the legal right to reclaim his own home. Tonight, he would sleep on Ron's couch one last time. Not because he had nowhere to go, but because he was preparing for war. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold. Mark dressed carefully in his work jacket and khakis. Not because the sheriff cared about his appearance, but because he wanted to feel like himself when he reclaimed his own life. He drove to Briarwood Drive and parked 3 houses down. The street was quiet at 9 a.m. Most neighbors had left for work. The ones who remained would have front row seats to whatever happened next. Mark's hands rested flat on his thighs to keep them steady. His heart rhythm was strong and even. The medication was working. Everything about his body felt prepared for what came next. The sheriff's cruiser appeared at the end of the street at exactly 9:15. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a white car with official markings rolling slowly through a suburban neighborhood. Mark felt something settle in his chest. Not calm exactly, something more solid than calm. Resolve that had been building for days and was finally ready to be used. The cruiser parked directly in front of the house. Deputy Martinez stepped out, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and the measured movements of someone who'd served difficult papers before. Susan's face appeared in the front window before the deputy reached the walkway. Her hair was pulled back too tight, making her look older and more severe. Behind her, Mark could see Kara's silhouette moving nervously through the kitchen. The deputy knocked twice, official knocks that echoed through the quiet street. Susan opened the door before the third knock could fall. She was wearing the same robe she'd worn every morning for the past month. Pink terry cloth that had seen better days. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Martinez with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. I have legal papers to serve regarding this property." Susan's voice was barely audible. "What kind of papers?" "Exclusive occupancy order. May I come in?" Kara appeared behind Susan, arms folded across her chest. Her defiance looked painted over fear, like makeup applied too heavily to cover flaws. "We don't have to let her in," Kara said. Deputy Martinez's voice remained professional. "This is a legally binding court order. It doesn't require your permission." The deputy stepped into the front hallway. Mark could see neighbors' curtains moving across the street. Mrs. Patterson from the house opposite was openly watching from her front porch. "This property is legally owned by Mark Ellison as sole proprietor," Deputy Martinez read from the court order. "Mr. Ellison has the right to exclusive occupancy of the premises." Susan's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her face had gone pale enough that Mark could see blue veins beneath her skin. "That's not possible," Kara said. Her laugh was too quick and too loud. "My mother lives here. She's lived here for years." "The deed is a matter of public record," Deputy Martinez replied. "This order doesn't require your agreement." Mark stepped out of his car and walked slowly up the driveway. Gravel crunched under his work boots. His breath came out in white puffs in the February air. "I didn't come to argue," Mark announced, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "I came to take my life back." The words landed solid and stayed. No echo, no question. Just statement of fact delivered in the tone of a man who'd stopped apologizing for existing. Kara tried her old weapon one more time. "Officer, I don't feel safe. He's been unstable. Threatening behavior." Deputy Martinez turned to look at Kara directly. "That allegation is noted. It does not change the court order." For the first time since this entire nightmare began, Kara's performance didn't move anyone. The deputy's expression remained neutral and unmoved. Mark felt something shift inside his chest. Not triumph exactly. Something cleaner than victory. Like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying suddenly lifting. "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez said to Susan, "you'll be given reasonable time to gather personal belongings." "How much time?" Susan's voice was barely a whisper. "Typically 48 hours for essential items. Additional arrangements can be made through the court for remaining possessions." Mark watched his wife absorb this information. Watched her understand that the house she'd lived in for 12 years was not, legally speaking, her home. "Where are we supposed to go?" Susan asked. Deputy Martinez's expression softened slightly. "That's not my area, ma'am. You'll need to make arrangements." Kara's voice rose to a near shriek. "This is insane. You can't throw us out on the street." "Nobody's being thrown anywhere," the deputy replied. "You're being informed that Mr. Ellison has the legal right to occupy his own property." Mark noticed a small crowd gathering across the street. Neighbors who'd stayed home from work or returned for lunch. He recognized most of them. Mrs. Patterson with her watering can. The young couple from 2 houses down. Old Mr. Chen from the corner lot. They weren't gathered to gossip. They were gathered to witness. Deputy Martinez mentioned something that made Mark's attention snap back to the conversation. "There are pending inquiries tied to this address," she said, reading from a second document. "Financial activity currently under investigation by multiple agencies." Kara went very still. Her eyes stopped darting around and fixed on a point somewhere past the deputy's shoulder. "What kind of inquiries?" Susan asked. "Medicare fraud, Social Security fraud, identity theft. The investigations are ongoing." Susan's face collapsed as understanding arrived. Not slowly, but all at once. Like a building that had been structurally compromised suddenly giving way. "Oh God," Susan whispered. "Oh God, what did you do?" The question was directed at Kara, but Kara had retreated into herself. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by the hunted look of someone who'd run out of lies. "Mrs. Patterson called out from across the street, loud enough for everyone to hear. I always wondered how she afforded all that new stuff." Other neighbors nodded. Mark realized they'd been watching. Noticing things. Drawing conclusions that he'd been too trusting to see. "The investigations will proceed independently of this occupancy order," Deputy Martinez said. "But Mr. Ellison has the right to secure his property pending their conclusion." Mark approached the front steps slowly. Each step felt significant, like reclaiming territory that belonged to him. Susan stepped aside as he reached the front porch. Not welcoming him exactly, but acknowledging his right to be there. 48 hours, Deputy Martinez repeated. "Essential items only. Mr. Ellison, you're within your rights to change the locks immediately." Mark nodded. "Thank you." The deputy handed him copies of the court order and walked back to her cruiser. The engine started with quiet efficiency. Official business conducted without drama or confrontation. Mark stood on his own front porch and looked out at the street he'd called home for 12 years. The neighbors were dispersing, returning to their own houses and normal Tuesday routines. But something had changed on Briarwood Drive. The truth had been spoken aloud in official language. Justice had arrived not with sirens and drama, but with paperwork and procedure. "Mark," Susan said quietly. "Can we talk?" Mark looked at his wife. Really looked at her. The tight hair and exhausted eyes and pink robe that had seen too many difficult mornings. "Talk about what?" he asked. Susan's answer came out as a whisper, "How to fix this." Mark felt the old pull to smooth things over. To find compromise. To prioritize peace over principle the way he'd done his entire adult life. "Some things can't be fixed," Mark said. "Some things just have to be acknowledged." He walked into his own house for the first time in a week. The air smelled different. Stale cigarette smoke and unfamiliar perfume. The furniture was rearranged. There were dishes in the sink he didn't recognize. But it was still his house. His address. His mortgage. His name on the deed. Susan and Kara began gathering clothes and toiletries without speaking to each other or to him. Their movements were quick and efficient. Like people evacuating before a storm. Mark didn't watch them pack. Instead, he walked through each room, taking inventory. Noticing what had changed. What had been moved or removed or added. In the kitchen, he opened the drawer where he kept important papers. Everything was gone. Medicare cards. Social Security documents. Bank statements. All of it removed, but Mark had copies now. Stored safely at Diane's office. Evidence collected and preserved for the investigations that were coming. 2 hours later, Susan and Kara loaded their car with suitcases and boxes. Susan moved like a woman in shock. Kara moved like a woman in flight. "Where will you go?" Mark asked. Susan looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know." It was the first honest thing she'd said to him in months. Mark stood in his driveway and watched them drive away. Susan looked back once through the rear window. Kara stared straight ahead. When their car disappeared around the corner, Mark was alone on Briarwood Drive. Alone in his own house. Alone with the quiet that comes after storms pass. That evening, Mark called Diane to report the successful service of papers. "How do you feel?" she asked. Mark considered the question. Different. Good different or bad different? Honest different. Diane was quiet for a moment. "The investigations will take months. But you've secured your foundation. What happens next?" "We wait. We document. We let the system work." Mark hung up and walked through his house one more time. He turned on lights in every room. His lights. His electricity bill. His right to illuminate his own space. In the kitchen, he made coffee using his own coffee maker and his own coffee grounds. The smell filled the house like a declaration of occupancy. For the first time in a week, Mark felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Not because he'd won a battle, but because he'd finally stopped apologizing for standing his ground. 3 months later, Mark lived in a different world. Not geographically, he still lived on Briarwood Drive in the same small ranch house. But the world inside that house had changed completely. The spare bedroom where Kara had lived was now Mark's home office. He'd bought a desk from a secondhand store and set up files organized by category. Medicare correspondence, Social Security fraud reports, police investigation updates. Each document was labeled and dated. Evidence of a system that was slowly but steadily working in his favor. Tuesday mornings had become Mark's favorite time of the week. He would make coffee at his own pace and read through his mail without anyone watching over his shoulder. Simple pleasure that he'd taken for granted for 30 years. This Tuesday, a letter arrived from the Medicare Fraud Investigation Unit. Mark opened it carefully, the way he opened all official mail now. With attention and respect for what it might contain. The letter was brief and professional. Investigation concluded. Fraudulent claims totaling $47,000 have been reversed. Criminal charges are being filed against Kara Michelle Stevens. $47,000. Mark sat at his kitchen table and stared at that number. It was more than he made in a year. More than most people's savings accounts. The money had been stolen one procedure at a time. A doctor's visit here. A prescription there. Small amounts that wouldn't trigger immediate attention. Professional theft disguised as clerical error. Mark's phone rang. Diane Keller's office. "Good news," Diane said when he answered. "The Social Security Administration has completed their investigation too. And? Full restitution. Your benefits are restored retroactively. You should see the corrected deposit next week." Mark felt something settle in his chest. Not relief exactly. Something more solid than relief. The satisfaction of watching truth prevail over deception. What about criminal charges? That's out of our hands now. But the evidence is overwhelming. Mark hung up and walked to his mailbox. The same mailbox where this entire nightmare had begun 3 months ago. Today it contained normal mail. Utility bills addressed to him. A magazine subscription in his name. No thick envelopes with fraudulent medical claims. Back inside, Mark spread the investigation letters across his kitchen table. Documents that proved he wasn't paranoid or unstable or confused. Documents that proved he'd been right to ask questions when things didn't make sense. The vindication felt good, but not in the way he'd expected. It wasn't triumphant or celebratory. It was quiet and steady. The feeling of being able to trust his own judgment again. Around noon, Mark drove to the Dayton Senior Center. A modest building with a community room and a small kitchen. Every Tuesday, they held a financial safety workshop for older adults. Mark had started attending 6 weeks ago, initially as a participant. Today he was one of 3 volunteers who helped facilitate the sessions. Elder financial abuse, he told the group of 12 seniors, usually happens slowly. Small changes that seem reasonable individually but add up to major theft over time. An older woman raised her hand. How do you recognize the signs? Mark thought about that question. About the Mercedes EOBs and the forged signatures and the bent corner on his Medicare card. Trust your instincts, he said. If something feels wrong, investigate it. Don't let anyone convince you that asking questions makes you paranoid. After the workshop, Mark stayed behind to help clean up, stacking chairs and wiping down tables. Simple work that felt meaningful. You're good at this, said Eleanor, the workshop coordinator. Have you considered speaking to larger groups? Mark paused with a folding chair in his hands. I'm not a public speaker. You're someone who survived something difficult. That's more valuable than training. Mark thought about Eleanor's words as he drove home. Survived seemed like the right word. He hadn't won exactly. He'd endured. He'd refused to disappear. Wednesday afternoon brought another letter. This one from Susan. Mark recognized her handwriting immediately. The same neat cursive she'd used to address Christmas cards for 30 years. He opened the envelope carefully and found 3 pages of blue stationery. Dear Mark, the letter began. I know I have no right to contact you, but I need you to understand what happened. Mark sat on his front porch to read the rest. The February air was still cold, but spring was beginning to show itself. Buds on the maple trees. Green shoots in Mrs. Patterson's flower garden across the street. Susan's letter was a confession and an apology wrapped together. She explained how Kara had gradually taken control of the household finances. How the credit cards and loans had started small and grown beyond control. How the domestic violence accusation had been Kara's idea when Mark began asking questions. I was scared, Susan wrote. Not of you, of losing the house, of being homeless. Kara convinced me that you would leave us if you knew the truth about the debt. Mark read the letter twice. Susan's fear was real and understandable. But it didn't excuse the forgeries or the fraud or the systematic theft of his identity. The letter ended with a request. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but could we meet and talk? Mark folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. He walked inside and placed it in his file cabinet under personal correspondence. Not hidden, but preserved. Evidence of a relationship that had existed and ended. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, fully charged and silent. He could call Susan. Could arrange the meeting she'd requested. Could try to rebuild something from the ruins of their marriage. Instead, Mark made dinner for one. Grilled chicken and steamed vegetables. Simple food eaten at his own pace while he read a book about woodworking. The silence in his house was different now. Not empty or lonely. Peaceful. The quiet that comes when you don't have to monitor every conversation for hidden meanings. Thursday evening, Mark drove to Home Depot and bought supplies to fix Mrs. Patterson's front steps. The wood was rotting in one corner, and she'd mentioned it to him last week. You don't have to do this, she said when he showed up Friday morning with tools and lumber. I want to, Mark replied. I like fixing things. Working with his hands felt good. Measuring twice, cutting once. Replacing old wood with new. Creating something solid and dependable. Mrs. Patterson brought him iced tea around noon. How are you doing? She asked. Really doing? Mark considered the question while he sanded a piece of pine board. I'm doing better. Good. We were all worried about you for a while. You were? The whole neighborhood. We could tell something was wrong, but we didn't know how to help. Mark looked across the street at his own house. It looked smaller from this angle. Less significant than it had felt when he was fighting to keep it. Did you know? Mark asked. About the fraud? Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment. We suspected. Too many new cars. Too many delivery trucks. But suspecting and knowing are different things. Mark nodded. He understood the difference now better than he ever wanted to. That afternoon, Mark received another call from Detective Kim. Kara Stevens was arrested this morning, she said. She's being charged with Medicare fraud, Social Security fraud, and identity theft. What about Susan? No charges against your wife. She's being treated as a victim of financial coercion. Mark felt conflicted about that decision. Susan had been a victim, but she'd also been a participant. The truth was complicated in ways that criminal law couldn't easily address. There will be a trial, Detective Kim continued. You'll likely be called to testify. Mark hung up and sat in his quiet kitchen, processing the information. Justice was coming, but it wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't restore the trust that had been broken or repair the relationships that had been destroyed. Saturday morning, Mark drove to his brother Ron's place for coffee and conversation. "How are you holding up?" Ron asked. "Some days are better than others." "You thinking about dating?" Mark almost choked on his coffee. "Ron, I'm not even divorced yet. I'm just saying, you're free now. Free to find someone who won't steal from you." Mark appreciated Ron's optimism, but the idea of trusting someone new felt impossible. Maybe someday, but not soon. Sunday after church, Mark walked through Woodland Cemetery. Not because he was morbid, but because it was quiet and beautiful. A place where he could think without interruption. He found himself at the grave of a woman named Dorothy Ellison. No relation, just someone who'd shared his last name. The headstone was simple: beloved wife and mother. She lived with dignity. Mark wondered what it meant to live with dignity. Was it about having a good reputation? Being respected by others? Or was it something more internal? The ability to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person staring back? For months, Mark had felt like a stranger to himself. Confused and paranoid and unable to trust his own perceptions. The fraud investigation had returned his money and cleared his name, but it had also returned something more valuable: his confidence in his own judgment. Walking back to his car, Mark passed a young couple visiting a grave together. They were holding hands and crying quietly, sharing grief in the way that people do when they genuinely care about each other. Mark felt a moment of sadness for what he'd lost with Susan. Not the marriage as it had actually been, but the marriage as he'd believed it to be. The partnership he'd thought they'd built over 30 years. But the sadness was clean. Free from the anger and confusion that had dominated the past few months. Just honest recognition of something that had ended. That afternoon, Mark organized his workshop in the garage. Tools that had been neglected for months were cleaned and properly stored. Wood scraps were sorted by size and type. Physical organization that reflected the mental clarity he was slowly rebuilding. Monday morning brought a routine that Mark had created for himself. Coffee and newspaper. Review of daily schedule. Check of bank accounts and credit reports. Simple tasks that confirmed his control over his own life. His phone rang during breakfast. Unknown number. "Mr. Ellison? This is Janet Morrison from the Ohio Attorney General's office. We're working on a documentary about elder financial abuse. Would you be interested in sharing your story?" Mark thought about the request. About the value of speaking publicly about private pain. What would that involve? An interview about your experience. How the fraud began, how you recognized it, how you fought back. The goal is education and prevention. Mark remembered Eleanor's words about speaking to larger groups. About the value of surviving something difficult. "I'll do it," Mark said. 2 weeks later, Mark sat in front of a camera and told his story to a documentary filmmaker. He spoke calmly and directly about the Medicare fraud and the forged documents and the systematic erasure of his identity. "What would you tell someone who suspects they're being victimized?" the interviewer asked. Mark looked directly into the camera. "Trust yourself. If something feels wrong, investigate it. Don't let anyone convince you that protecting yourself makes you paranoid or difficult." "And what would you tell family members who might be considering this kind of fraud?" Mark's answer was quiet but firm: "It's not just money you're stealing. It's trust. It's dignity. It's the victim's ability to feel safe in their own life. The money can be replaced. The trust cannot." When the interview was finished, Mark felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief or satisfaction, but completion. Like a story that had been left hanging for months was finally reaching its proper ending. Driving home, Mark noticed the for sale sign in front of a house 2 streets over. A modest ranch similar to his own. He wondered who would buy it, what kind of family would make it their home. For a moment, he considered whether he should sell his own house. Start fresh somewhere new, without the memories and associations of the past year. But as he pulled into his driveway, Mark realized he didn't want to leave. The house on Briarwood Drive wasn't just where the fraud had happened. It was also where he'd learned to stand up for himself. Where he'd chosen truth over peace. Where he'd discovered that his own judgment was worth defending. That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table with a pen and a piece of paper. For the first time in months, he had something to say that felt worth writing. Dear Eleanor, he began. I've been thinking about your suggestion regarding public speaking. The letter was brief but definitive. Mark offered to speak at senior centers and community groups about elder financial abuse prevention. He included his contact information and availability. Before he could reconsider, Mark walked to the mailbox and dropped the letter inside. The red flag went up, signaling outgoing mail. Tomorrow the letter would begin its journey to Eleanor's desk. Soon after that, Mark would begin a new kind of work. Not fixing broken pipes and door hinges, but helping people recognize and prevent a different kind of damage. The work felt right in a way that surprised him. Purpose born from pain, but purpose nonetheless. As Mark walked back to his house, he noticed his name on the mailbox. Mark Ellison, printed clearly in block letters that had weathered 2 Ohio winters but remained legible. For the first time in his adult life, Mark looked at his own name and felt no doubt about who it belonged to. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending